Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So today I'd like to go over the best artifacts you should be using to buff up your party's damage. Literally everybody should be using this, from tanks, healers to even DPS characters. So let's have a look. Which ones should you be using to be most effective? Which ones should you get upgraded? Here's a quick chart. And let's move on to give a quick overview of how each of them work and which ones are indeed the best. You can see in general, most artifacts will give like a 10% damage buff, and then there are of course lesser ones which only give a 5% buff. Now if we look here in the Crown of Caldecon trial, the latest Endgame trial, you will have your group coordinated so that each member is using a different artifact. They usually don't stack on top of each other, and you can see here where we have the Valindra with Palavorthine phase. We phase Palavorthine, he flies off, and then Valindra's alone. And you can see our damage output appears to be really not great. And then we go and call artifacts, and bam, you can see the massive amount of damage we can output with an artifact call. You're essentially dealing double the amount of damage that you normally would without these artifacts active. Along with that, you're of course also having some mount combat powers to go with it. Now I've gathered here all of the buff artifacts that will aid your party in dealing more damage. I do miss one, which is the Vanguard's Banner, reducing the enemy's defense resistance by 5%, essentially giving you a 5% additional damage boost. So I've went and tested each and every one of these artifacts. For example, we go slot in our Sigil of the Nine. We go then to our dummy. We make sure we have our combat log active. We go and first attack our dummy, having a look at our power and critical severity. And with that hitting, you can see we have our old strike, and we can have a look here, sorting it by damage. Here's the basic damage value of all of our critical hits that weren't dodged. 2,683.7 damage. And we can have a look in our document. This is indeed the damage we are getting with this base damage, this power, this crit severity, this ability score, and also these damage buffs. We're getting 2% from having our weapon set, 10% from having a buff to Oath Strike on our modification, and a 3% buff from having our Queen's Golden Opal Ring, giving us that Swordsman's perk. And thus we can see our exact damage output is equal to the damage we're getting on regards to the combat tracker. So then to test out the artifact, we simply go back and we cast our artifact and we continue hitting. And while we hit, we should then see an increase in regards to our damage output. You can see now we're looking at 2,753.8. So we go back to our damage buff, we copy this down here, Sigil of the Nine, and we can find out that indeed it's just a 3% additive buff. By changing this from 15%, you can see with 15% damage buff, it's equal. And if we change this to 18, you can see plus 3%, we're getting 2,753. This exact damage value here. If we were to have it multiplicative, that would be a 0.3 buff there, that 3%, and this reduced to 15, you can see that would be 2,764, meaning that's not equal to what we're seeing, meaning it's actually an additive buff and not a multiplicative buff, which means it's a little bit worse, because the more of these damage buffs you have, the less effective adding more buffs on is. If we were to have, let's say, this at 2, let's say we have 100% damage buffs, and we were to go add a 3% buff to that. And you can see that set up here. You can see everything's the same. The buff goes from 2 to 2.03. That's adding 3%. And the total damage gain you gain would be less than a 1.5%. So keep that in mind. And that's how we're testing all of these artifacts. The Book of the Vile Darkness ended up as multiplicative with a 15%. Pretty good. Charm of the Serpent, multiplicative 10%. Despite that it says 16% in the tooltip. The Demogorgon's Reach, very interestingly, ended up only giving 2% additional multiplicative damage per stack and not 3%. You can see the tooltip of Demogorgon's Reach here, and it says enemies should take 3% more damage per stack, and they don't. They only receive 2% increased damage per stack, up to a maximum of 12% multiplicative buff to our damage. The Erratic Drift Globe is a little bit of a different story. You can see the Globe's tooltip will essentially reduce the enemy's deflection by 20,000. That's the equivalent of 20%. So they will deflect 20% less often. So looking at our chart, we go to our damage modification here with the formula, and we essentially change this from 0.5 to 0.3. You can see this other one has a 0.5, and that just reduces the enemy's deflect chance down from 50% to 30%. However, that will then depend on how high your accuracy is. If your accuracy is 70%, the damage buff you will gain on average is only 3.6%. Let's say I have 10% accuracy. You would gain a 11.4% damage buff. Let's say you have 80% accuracy, then you would only gain a 1.9% buff. And yes, you guessed it, if you have capped accuracy at 90%, you gain no benefit from the Erratic Drift Globe because you're already negating all of the enemy's deflect severity. And then we had our Frozen Storyteller journal, and that ends up to be a 10% additive buff. You can see our buffs are up to 1.25. Hetfield Blast Scepter, very good at a multiplicative 15% buff. Heart of the Black Dragon, multiplicative 10% buff. The Jewel of the North, giving also a multiplicative 10% buff. Same with the Lantern of Revelation. The Mythalar being another very good one with a 15% multiplicative buff. Then you have the Neverwinter Standard, 5% multiplicative. Same with the Sparkling Emblem. Thirst is a 10%. Token of Chromatic Storm is a 10%, and Wyvern Venomized is actually a 12%. And overall, we can see that on a table just here. This is your artifact in alphabetical order, the damage buff that you would actually gain, the duration that that's up for, and then also whether it's multiplicative or additive. An X means multiply, and a plus means additive. And we just have the Sigil of the Nine and the Frozen Storyteller journal. The rest are all multiplicative and should stack separately, meaning if you have 10 of these multiplicative ones active that, let's say, gave 10%, that would be 100% boost to your damage. That's basically multiplying your damage by 2. Keep in mind the Book of Vile Darkness. You can see through the tooltip that you have a chance to gain one of the following benefits: Disorder, Anguish, or Savagery. And Savagery is what you want to increase your party's damage. Unfortunately, that makes it only a 33% chance to actually have an effect to gain that 15% damage boost, which on average would only then give you a 5% buff. And it will also depend the duration on your at-will attack speed. How quickly can you get all stacks active? And then once all stacks are active, they only last for 6 seconds. Demogorgon's Reach needs a 6-second build-up time. Erratic Drift Globe, again, it's entirely dependent on your accuracy, and your Token of Chromatic Storm can miss when you go and cast it. As you can see, here we go. It basically has these balls flying down, and if your target's like smaller than this dummy, then it could miss, like Rilliss or Zariel. I don't think there's any way you're going to miss the big fat dragon in Crown of Caldecon. And so ultimately we end up with this chart where I've ranked them from 1 to 17 in terms of which ones I would take in my group. And the top 2 places there is the Mythalar Fragment and the Hetfield Blast Scepter, with giving a huge 15% boost to your party's damage. You can use both of those and they'll give you a 30% damage boost. It's pretty massive. Then you have your Wyvern, your Demogorgons, and then I've ordered them in ranking of how user-friendly they are. The Lantern has a nice quick cast time. Heart of the Black Dragon has a nice quick cast time. Charm of the Serpent gets a little bit more sluggish, along with Token of Chromatic Storm, and also Token of Chromatic Storm can miss. And then Thirst, you can animation cancel it so that you don't go flying forward. To show this effect, we'll just go and cast it here. You go lunging forward like that. However, you can cancel that lunge effect by like activating your shield or a power. And then there's the Jewel of the North, which has the exact same lunge power, but you cannot cancel it. And they all give 10%, and these would be my top 10 artifacts every trial group should be running with. Of course, if a scenario doesn't see fit that you could purposely run a Thirst or the Jewel of the North, then by all means rank down a bit and take the Vanguard, Neverwinter Standard, or the Sparkling Fey Emblem. The Vanguard Banner is on 11th place there because its uptime is 30 seconds. And you can see that just there. You could have 2 people which would have this, and you could have one active all of the time. Again, that's also dependent on what fight you're in and how much the boss moves around, and are you always going to have the boss in that area or not? And the Neverwinter Standard, again, you're going to have to be within the area. Same with the Sparkling Fey Emblem. Their areas aren't exactly the largest. You can see them there, but if you're in a stationary boss fight, it shouldn't be too hard. And yes, in 14th place, I have the Frozen Storyteller Journal. You can argue, yes, it does indeed give a 10% damage boost to your allies, but keep in mind, this is an additive buff. So if I already have 100% in buffs, adding 10% is only the equivalent of less than 5% overall damage. And then you have the Book of the Vile Darkness. Again, it's a 33% chance or a third chance that you could proc the actual damage buff. When you do, it's 15%, but when you don't, it's nothing. And otherwise, there's the Erratic Drift Globe, dependent on everybody's accuracy, and the Sigil of the Nine, only giving a 3% additive buff, which if we give it the same treatment as the Frozen Storyteller Journal, this 3% should actually be a 1.5%. So definitely not worth picking up. And so that's my chart, and those are the best damage buff artifacts in the game right now. If they add more, I'll come back to this video again and probably update this chart. And with that said, hopefully this has been somewhat helpful as to which artifacts you could choose. Again, here's a quick clip from the new trial where you can output massive burst damage when you activate these artifacts. You're dealing twice as much damage when you have them all active, which means that is the key time to be using your big damage hitting daily powers and be using your massive hitting mount combat powers like Golden Touch, Tunnel Vision, 3000 magnitude, and you'd make sure you have all of your encounter powers to use in that short window as well when artifacts are called. And this is what sets apart pug groups, which are randomly created groups, to pre-made groups. Since in a pre-made group, you will have those artifacts sorted. Each person will have a unique one. Nobody's using some personal artifact which only buffs your own damage by like 5% or 10%. That's nothing compared to an overall 10% damage buff or 5% damage buff to the entire group. So hopefully this video has shown you somewhat of the importance of running these artifacts. Again, here's the chart, and I would highly recommend you pick up and upgrade a few of these so that when you do run content, you can help out your group. And ideally, one of you will call artifacts and you'll all use them together. Even just running random dungeons, random trial queues, it can be a major benefit when you're coordinated just a little bit. So with that said, I'd like to give a massive thank you to all of my channel members for helping me keep my channel going. And if I presented this well, consider leaving the video a like. If you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.